This is a story about disbelief that begins in ordinary places. A guarded bus stop outside a fenced town in Tennessee, a rail siding on the sagebrush flats of Washington state, a windswept plateau in New Mexico, where the wind carried the smell of machine oil and the faint clang of steel. The disbelief belongs to German prisoners of war, and later to captured German scientists who discovered piecemeal at first, then in overwhelming detail, that the United States had constructed not one secret laboratory but a whole industrial ecosystem dedicated to splitting atoms. They did not disbelieve because they were ignorant of physics. Many understood the nuclear problem as well as any men living. They disbelieved because nothing in their wartime experience prepared them for a nation that could build cities out of purpose, synthesize populations overnight, and feed those places with enough power to make the countryside hum. For a POW shipped to the American interior in 1944, the country often felt impossible before a single rumor reached him. The trains arrived on time and left with new cars in their wake. Cafeterias served hot meals on real plates, boots fit. Trucks were not repurposed from something else. They were new. This baseline abundance mattered because it set the stage for the second revelation. There were towns the maps did not mention, sprawls of barracks and clapboard houses thrown up so quickly that grass had not yet decided where to grow. From the highway they looked like any other war housing, except that their traffic patterns were odd and their timetables relentless. Shift whistles sounded in the dark. Buses fanned out at precise intervals. At the gates, guards checked badges, and the roads inside vanished into curves flanked by buildings whose size mocked the word lab. The POW could not see colutrons or diffusion cascades or chemical canyons, and in truth almost no one outside the inner ring could. But he could see a new geography, empty valleys that now needed traffic signals, hillsides threaded with cable, riverbanks armored with intake structures, and ridge lines crowned by transmission towers that had no business in a town that young. Disbelief lived in the details. The ordinary soldier had learned to measure a factory by its smoke and a depot by its stacks. Here, the measurement was noise and light transformers that sang at night, a strangeness in the air at shift change, a clock speed that belonged to a city many times larger. People speak of secrecy as silence, but the American secret was that it spoke in infrastructure. It spoke in the miles of bus routes needed to ferry workers who did not know what they were building. It spoke in the fresh-cut smell of lumber and the sweet chemical bite that hung around the perimeters of new plants. It spoke in the tangle of clipboard instructions that told everyone only enough to do their job and absolutely nothing that would help them guess the job of the person 3 doors down. The POW might decide at first that all of this was a mirage born of wartime exaggeration. Then the newspapers began to print cautious stories about extraordinary projects in remote locales. Then a guard let slip a figure, the number of employees, the length of a fence line, the astonishing consumption of electricity. Then the mushroom cloud, and the guard did not need to say anything at all. For captured scientists, the disbelief took a different shape. When they learned of Hiroshima at Farm Hall and of the American program's sheer throughput, their first reaction was professional shock, a calculus of scale, rather than a failure of imagination. If the United States had produced a deliverable device by the summer of 1945, the Americans must have run parallel enrichment tracks to hedge technical risk. They must have coordinated physics with chemical engineering, procurement with power authorities, and military transport with civilian contractors in a way that kept the pipelines full and the conversations compartmentalized. The scientists understood what it meant to calculate cross-sections and mean free paths. What they had underestimated was what a continental economy could do with those equations when it was not being bombed and when it was willing to pay for simultaneous answers. They had not misread the atom. They had misread America. There is a temptation to imagine these places as purely abstract triumphs of policy and funding, but the German prisoners encountered them as weather and terrain. In Tennessee, the air was soft and damp, and the roads to the fenced city were newly laid and already patched where heavy trucks had bitten through. The hills carried a lace of lines slung from poles that stepped like soldiers across pasture and creek. The town itself felt temporary in all the ways that matter: thin walls, hot water that ran with a cough, sidewalks that ended in crushed stone, but the plants were not temporary. Their foundations disappeared into the ridge, and the doors swallowed shift after shift with an appetite that never slowed. In Washington, the sense of scale came differently. The sky was wider, the distances longer, the structures set back as if to let each one have its own horizon. Because the river ran close and cold, the air near the big buildings felt like a different season even in summer. You could taste the project in the wind there. In New Mexico, the scale inverted. Los Alamos did not look like a factory at all. It looked like a hidden town where everyone's job was to think with their hands, and yet the wires and roads told the same story. This was a city built in a hurry for a purpose that outgrew any single building. By the time the war ended, the disbelief that had first protected German pride had hardened into a reluctant respect. The prisoners understood that they had been fighting against more than divisions and air fleets. They had been fighting against a production philosophy that accepted delay only when it bought certainty, a managerial culture that solved risk by paying for two solutions at once, and an electrical grid that could throw a fraction of a nation's power into one valley without asking the rest of the country to go dark. The POWs had not lacked courage or insight or skill. They had lacked, as most of Europe did by 1943, the luxury of building three answers to the same question until one of them changed the world. The numbers begin bluntly and become astonishing only after you sit with them. The American atomic program employed roughly 130,000 people at its peak, and the money poured into it, about $2 billion in wartime currency, would expand to many times that figure in today's terms. Those numbers sound like a government's casual exaggeration until you place them on the ground. Imagine a single valley town that planners originally thought might hold 30,000 residents if they were clever with space and disciplined about sewage and schools. Now watch it swell towards 70 or 80,000 before the plaster has set in the first houses and before any mapmaker feels safe printing its name. That is not a laboratory culture. That is an urbanization event forced into a box labeled temporary. German prisoners worked near farms, sawmills, rail yards, sugar refineries, and canning plants, and those places taught them to read the signs of scale accurately. At a canning plant, you count the empty tins in towers. At a refinery, you count the tank cars and the depth of the smell in your clothes after a shift. At a rail yard, you count the pairs of hands needed to pull a train back into motion after a long stop. When those same prisoners looked toward the secret towns, they found that the ordinary cues failed them. The buildings were larger than any mill they knew, but the exhaust told them little because filtration and dilution hid the odors with an engineer's precision. The usual thunder of heavy industry had been replaced by a steadier sound: fans, compressors, and transformers that did not so much roar as insist. The soldiers were careful men, and they tried to avoid wild claims. They learned to discount the dramatist and to trust the quiet person who had counted 3 new bus lines in as many weeks and who had noticed that the transformer yard grew like a hedge, one steel bloom at a time. To appreciate why disbelief took root, you have to remember what electricity meant in 1943 to someone from a continent at war. Electricity was not a metaphor for progress. It was the hard limit on what could be done. If a plant took more power, something else made do with less. Rationing was not only about food and fuel, it was about kilowatts. So when rumors spread that the Tennessee site consumed a measurable slice of the nation's power generation, that detail was not decoration, it was diagnostic. It meant the project was not merely important, it meant the project had been given priority within the great machine that kept lights on and factories hot. German POWs could imagine a lab with a dozen bright men and a budget that bought fine instruments. They struggled to imagine a government that would allocate so much current to a single valley that the rivers themselves felt pledged to it. The human count took longer to absorb because what people notice first in a new town is not the census but the threshold at which the town becomes self-referential. You arrive at that point when there are enough children to make the school's noise feel natural, enough paperboys to justify a route map, enough barbers that no one waits long enough to complain. In the secret towns, that point arrived too quickly to feel normal. The market shelves did not sag because the supply chain had been built backwards from demand. Bus schedules did not collapse under their own weight because there was always another bus waiting at the edge of the plan. The prisoners watched with a professional curiosity that had nothing to do with sympathy. They had seen occupied cities fail to replenish the basics. Here, even basics looked bespoke. The sidewalks went up where the bus stops needed them. The bus stops moved when the shift times changed. For people who had learned to sleep through air raid sirens, a system that adjusted itself to people, rather than forcing people to adjust to it, felt indecently luxurious. These fast facts bled into slower realizations about American power. The POWs learned that these places had been built not because one committee had been unusually brave, but because multiple committees had been told to proceed until something worked. When your memory of wartime procurement involves pleading for a small allocation of copper and arguing for weeks about whether your unit rate justifies a transport allowance, the sight of copper by the mile can paralyze thought. It was not just that the United States had copper, it was that it could afford to line entire buildings with it and then start a second building while the first was still testing components. The German prisoners did not need to see inside a single instrument to know that the ambitions were industrial. The electricity drew its own contour map, and the workforce filled it in, one busload at a time. What the men did not realize immediately, and what only becomes clear in retrospect, is how cleverly the Americans turned ignorance into a security asset. The classic spy novel vision of secrecy, whispers in corridors, coded messages in classifieds, has little to do with this. The Americans did not rely on silence so much as on noise, the chatter of logistics so overwhelming that no one person could hold the whole project in his head. A machinist could be proud of his tolerances and know almost nothing about the substance he made room for. A clerk could check badges with flawless diligence and have no idea why the badges needed to rotate. A bus driver could learn every bend in the road and be unable to point on a map to where he ended each day. The POWs saw enough to know that there was something terrible in the making, but the parts they saw did not link neatly until the day newspapers stripped the euphemisms and the world learned what an industrial miracle looks like when it detonates. Those are the facts as the prisoners would have encountered them, not as a tidy list pinned to a corkboard, but as a drumbeat of impressions confirmed by figures, as rumors purified into statistics, as the daily sight of a town that insisted on growth, while the rest of the world practiced survival. And that is why disbelief, though perfectly reasonable at the start, could not survive contact with the evidence. Numbers are very patient. They wait until you are ready to hear them. Then they add themselves up in front of you, and you have to admit what they have been trying to say. The timeline begins before the first fence post in Tennessee, before the first roadbed in Washington, before anyone thought to buy a bus depot's worth of schedules. In the late 1930 seconds, nuclear fission is a paper fact on both sides of the Atlantic. The scientific world is small, cosmopolitan, and frightened by what it has learned. In the United States, the early money is exploratory, a handful of appropriations that look like rounding errors in the war budget. In Europe, the thinking is sharper, the circumstances darker, the resources constrained. War is a thief of attention, and a terrible manager. It demands daily improvisation. By 1942, the American improvisation becomes a plan, and the plan becomes a project with a name, and very quickly, a map. The map matters because it shows choices that, to an engineer's eye, read like a confession of ambition. Oak Ridge will sit where the Tennessee Valley Authority can feed it, and where hills give cover to vast buildings. Hanford will take up ground near a river that can cool what it must cool, and far from a population that would ask too many questions. Los Alamos will hide in altitude and distance, and move under a cover story as thin as air. Construction proceeds as if the calendar is a dare. People who understand the materials say the schedules are impossible. People who understand the war say the schedules are the only ones that make sense. Foundations go in before designs are final, because the final designs are plural. Processes run in parallel, not because the Americans think redundancy is an art form, but because they have decided that duplicated success is cheaper than singular failure. The key months have a rhythm. In 1943, the towns fill faster than the trucks can level the ground. In 1944, the snake of production learns how to swallow without choking. Raw feed becomes intermediate, becomes product, and for the first time the curve of outputs begins to look like something a general can read. Somewhere in this period, a POW loading sacks at a mill 2 states away hears that a quiet valley has become a city by fiat. He thinks it is a joke or a misheard story. Then, on leave, a guard from that valley tells him about a bus route that never ends. The weapons program is not synchronized with the prisoner's knowledge, but both timelines accelerate in 1945. At the secret laboratory in New Mexico, where the roads seem new no matter how often the trucks pass, the calculations catch up to the parts, and the parts learn to live with each other. Trials that would be rites of passage in any other age are treated here as steps, because there is no time to dress anything as ceremony. The test in the desert turns intention into proof. News travels by the oddest paths on that day. A radio in England becomes a serpent in a quiet room of captured scientists. A rumor at a POW camp in the Midwest becomes a clipping that arrives 3 days late and still changes every conversation at dinner. The calendar does not care who learns what first. It cares only that the shape of the war has shifted, and the shape of disbelief with it. After the bombs fall in August and the fighting stops, there is a new kind of counting. Newspaper photographs that never show the crucial angles are more honest than the euphemisms that preceded them. Official statements insist on precision while refusing detail. The prisoners board ships or trains and carry home a story that cannot be told without reference to power plants and payrolls and the way a town sounds at midnight when the night shift is changing. Their timeline converges with the engineer's timeline in a single conclusion. The United States did not merely outrun its enemies on a single axis of effort. It moved on several at once, laying down parallel tracks and letting the one that arrived first set the clock for history. Looking back, it is easy to compress these years into a montage of groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings, but the daily life inside the timeline never felt like a montage. It felt like a series of problems that could be solved only by agreeing, before every meeting, that the answer had to be big and that it had to exist by a date that turned seasoned builders pale. It felt like a willingness to pretend that hundreds of small towns could spring up without disturbing the map, and that men and women could be assembled into a workforce on a theory of loyalty enforced by paperwork. It felt like buses turning in the dark and laundries that never closed. For the prisoners who saw pieces of this machine from the outside, the timeline was a rumor with increasing resolution. For the scientists who listened to the radio and measured their pride against a transcript of surprise, the timeline was proof that they had mistaken the slope of the American learning curve. The simple timeline, then, is this. An idea that was once a set of papers becomes a set of buildings. The buildings acquire a population. The population teaches itself to do the impossible by dividing the impossible into unremarkable tasks. The outputs cross a threshold. The world is different. The men who could not believe it at first were not blind. They were standing in the wrong place to see how quickly roads can turn into a plan when a nation decides to push all its chips across the table and then find more chips just in case. The genius of the American approach to secrecy was to make the truth uninteresting at the level where most people could see it. A guard knew rules. A machinist knew tolerances. A clerk knew badge numbers. A bus driver knew a pattern of stops that changed every 2 weeks. Each of these fragments was drab, bureaucratic, even dull, and none of them betrayed the fact that the valley beyond the guard post was consuming power like a steelworks and producing an invisible commodity measured in grams. The system did not rely on silence so much as on a carefully engineered ignorance, a compartmentalization that made honest people into excellent walls. Ask anyone on the wrong side of the line to describe his work, and you would get a clear answer that sat in the mind like a brick. Bricks tell you nothing about the house unless you have the plan. Conventional secrecy takes pride in being small and clever exfiltration, surveillance, codes slipped into the personals. This secrecy was large and slow, and almost impersonal. It hid in the weight of trucks and the height of fences, and the way the gate light washed the gravel. It hid in procurement shipments of copper, so large they required their own logic, orders for specialty chemicals that made suppliers shrug and add another shift. It hid in the plain language of work orders that specified only what could be accomplished by one pair of hands in one room. It hid in the way the towns were built with the amenities of ordinary life, so that the extraordinary would blend into the rhythm of school bells and grocery runs. Children and movie theatres and bus shelters have a way of laundering intent. If the place looks like a community, the mind will let it be one. Power is the thread that leads you through the maze, if you know how to follow it. A fence can be explained as prudence. A badge can be explained as policy. But the transformer yards and the substations and the marching lines of pylons insist on a different kind of explanation. They demand a plant with an appetite. In the Tennessee Valley, the appetite had the backing of dams that threw a river's force into the grid. In Washington, the river itself was a collaborator, its cold flow, a promise that reactors could be cooled and that the heat would go somewhere the eye could not follow. The prisoners might not have had the vocabulary to name these relationships, but they recognized the pattern that emerges when utilities become destiny. You cannot hide a city's worth of electrons. You can only normalize them by making their passage feel routine. The planners understood this and worked with it rather than against it. They did not attempt to build a single thing that would announce itself to the curious. They built many things that would repeat themselves until the repetition felt natural. Bus turnarounds, tool cribs, cafeteria benches, switchgear panels, doors that stuck in summer and froze in winter. People remember anomalies. They do not remember sameness. So the sameness was designed. The cafeterias served the same coffee in the same thick cups. The guards wore the same expressions and said the same jokes. The paperwork moved in predictable channels even when the ideas did not. If a rumor began to gather speed, someone had heard that the power draw exceeded any mills, then an official could kill the rumor not by denying the number, but by drowning it in routines. Yes, the load is heavy. Please remember your badge is invalid after the 12th of the month. The mind will grab the practical task and drop the extraordinary claim as if it were a hot coal. Geography performed its own miracles for the project. The hills in Tennessee carved the plant into neighborhoods whose curves concealed scale, and the forests ate the sound before it could travel too far. The basin in Washington worked like a bowl that you could only see across if you stood in exactly the right place, and no one without a reason ever stood in that place. New Mexico offered space and sky, and the kind of distance that turns roads into rumor. What all three had in common was the possibility of owning the horizon. That is the simplest definition of a secret in the open. A thing that controls what you can see along the line where the earth meets the sky. The American sites did this elegantly, less by drama than by patience. They fenced and posted where they had to, but mostly they let the land be the land and adjusted their lines to its indifference. None of this would have worked without the social technology to match it, and that technology was the payroll. A town paid on time is a quiet town. A town whose buses run when they ought to will not ferment stories at the stops. A town whose children can expect vaccinations and whose laundries do not run out of soap will not listen too closely to the man who wants to tell a tale about a machine that can flip the sun into a bomb. The planners did not need to convince anyone of a noble purpose. They needed to convince everyone of a dependable process. Most people will trade a little mystery for a lot of competence. The German prisoners who had watched competence bleed out of their own cities under bombing and scarcity recognized the bargain even as they resented it. Secrecy has a moral complexion that changes with the century. In wartime it is framed as prudence, and almost any means can be argued as necessary. Afterward, the same structures look ominous. The fences rust, the bus schedules are archived and read as literature. The power that once thrilled engineers becomes a cost on a ledger that belongs to a different age. The POWs never saw the program as anything but a weapon, however elegant its methods. Yet even they, returning home through ports that smelled of diesel and foreign tobacco, could admit the coherence of the system they had glimpsed. The Americans had hidden a city by teaching it to behave exactly like a city and nothing like a fortress. They had hidden a weapon by naming it work. They had made the extraordinary into a choreography of the ordinary, and they had trusted that the choreography would pass for life. That is how you hide an industrial city inside a war. You do not make it invisible. You make it boring up close and implausible at a distance. You let the buses do your lying for you. You let the rivers carry away the heat and the noise. You make the forms legible and the purpose opaque. And in the end, when the secret stands up in the desert and introduces itself in a light the whole world misunderstands at first, the people who never believed in the place finally understand that they were looking at it all along. Oak Ridge did not look like a decision. It looked like a bet that kept winning. The valley had been chosen for its hills and its river, and the power that older dams could be made to yield. But what stunned anyone who came near it, or even heard the rumors that bled out past the checkpoints, was how quickly the place learned to speak in the language of a real city. Houses went up like corn, utilities arrived like weather, and the buses kept time better than some churches kept faith. A town that was supposed to be small enough to hide turned into something so large it could only be hidden by calling it ordinary. Day by day, the population swelled until the word temporary lost all meaning. Streets that had been sketched with the caution of engineers became the assertive strokes of planners who knew they would not be told no, and the workers who stepped off the buses each dawn did so with the same tired confidence as any mill town, except that the mills here had doors thicker than vaults and windows that looked outward like eyes trained to lie. If you were a German prisoner, anywhere within 2 states of this place, you heard a number first, not a theory. Maybe it was the number of residents, a figure that sounded like a county rather than a project. Maybe it was the electricity, described in a tone that mingled pride and disbelief, as if someone had misplaced a fraction of the nation's power and left it buzzing in a valley behind a fence. The number did not compute if your world had been carved by austerity and bombers. It suggested a logic you did not recognize. A willingness to pay for 3 solutions at once because one might arrive on time, and the others, even if they failed, would teach useful lessons about the future. The POW who heard these things would search for the flaw in the American brag, and find that the flaw lay not in arithmetic, but in a European habit of assuming the grid was a stern parent who never yielded extra light. Here, the grid behaved like a partner, and the dams seemed to grin. Oak Ridge did not sell itself as glamorous. Its persuasion was monotony at scale. The cafeterias served the same meals the same way to crowds that were somehow always in motion. Shops opened on corners that had been surveyed the week before. The laundry lines told a story about families arriving faster than rumor could prepare their neighbors for the noise of children. Every person had a badge and a place to be and a set of words they were allowed to use about their day. The smallness of each person's vocabulary was not an insult. It was a design feature. You could describe everything you touched without ever drawing a straight line to the purpose behind your touch. A guard could live his entire contract believing he was protecting expensive equipment rather than the hinge of history, and a machinist could measure tolerances that would make a watchmaker sweat while never learning the name of the device that needed that perfection. If secrecy is a chorus, Oak Ridge learned to sing with thousands of voices, none of which carried a full melody on its own. The architecture gave away what the people could not say. The biggest buildings did not hide so much as refuse to announce. They were simple in the way a battleship is simple: flat planes, functional angles, surfaces that absorbed attention without repaying it. But the plant yards filled with spools and valves, and the complicated furniture of industrial ambition, and the eye that had been trained on rail depots and refinery turrets could not miss the implication. This was not a one-off experiment. Nothing about the place suggested rehearsal. It was a production environment with layers of redundancy, and even if you could not name a single process, you could count the fail-safes by the way. Duplicate pipes ran like lines of rhyme along the walls. The quiet of the buildings had a mechanical origin, the kind of soundproofing that separates pulse from rumor, and the result was unsettling. Men who expected great endeavors to roar were forced to admit that some of the loudest acts in history are organized to whisper. The valley's biggest secret was not the parts, It was the patience to let the parts work. Deadlines, the kind that in wartime are pinned up like wanted posters, were real, but there was a civility to the pace once you were inside. Somewhere above the workers' heads a clock was ticking, but at ground level the schedules were designed to protect precision from panic. Inspectors took time to reject what did not meet the mark. Teams rebuilt what needed rebuilding without melodrama. The place ran on the paradox that speed is fastest when it is not allowed to hurry. That paradox is impossible to fake. It requires the kind of money that gives planners the courage to throw away good enough, and the kind of electrical headroom that lets a building eat mistakes without going black. For German prisoners whose memory of the last 2 years had been a series of bargains with scarcity, the audacity of refusing good enough was the strangest luxury of 2 all. There was a human cost to all of this that the official photographs never found. Oak Ridge was built from borrowed time and rented privacy. Couples learned to talk around whole days. Friends learned to ask better questions. Jokes that were unmistakably about everything and, on paper, about nothing. The children adjusted first, as they always do. They internalized fence lines as boundaries the way farm kids internalize creeks. They learned the geography of buses by heart. They also learned the strange pulse of a 2-shift town, where dinner time did not mean a single hour, and where the glow behind the horizon meant more than weather. The town invented rituals to replace the ones that could not fit behind gates. Friday nights at the gym, church picnics that looked down from hills onto rows of rectilinear roofs, a movie theater whose projector could make the world outside the fence seem tender by comparison. All those normalities were also part of the disguise. A secret with a stable routine is a secret with a plausible alibi, and Oak Ridge practiced its alibi until even its inhabitants believed it. No one man could see Oak Ridge whole. That was both the point and the poetry. A statistician could admire the payroll, a foreman the safety record, a power engineer the way the substations stepped down the river's promise into useful work. A visiting colonel could admire the order with which disorder was banished, the paper trails that curved and ended before they reached anything as dangerous as meaning. And a German prisoner, catching a ride on the back of a truck that briefly paralleled a fence and then turned back into fields, could admire none of that, and still feel the project's size in his chest the way a person feels weather coming. The numbers that didn't add up: a town too big, a grid too generous, a schedule too precise, finally added up to a new category of place, one that could not have existed in his world and yet existed here with a confidence that dared you to call it a myth. In the end, the most telling artifact of Oak Ridge was not a photograph or a blueprint, but a silence. It was the silence of people who had lived in a city that was a sentence with its subject hidden. It followed them when they left and colored the way they remembered the war, not as a sequence of battles, but as a lesson in what a nation can do when it chooses to build 3 answers in a row and stop only when the last one works. The German who first met Oak Ridge as a rumor might leave America believing in the rumor's truth more fiercely than any American who had lived there. Outsiders often see scale more clearly. They lack the mercy of familiarity. In the sage and river country of Washington, the American appetite for scale became a kind of landscape art. Hanford did not emerge from the ground so much as reorganize it. The Columbia ran cold and confident nearby, and the plan was to make that confidence do work, to turn flow into cooling, to turn an emptiness of desert into safe distance, to turn distance itself into a guard whose loyalty never wavered. If Oak Ridge was an argument about electricity, Hanford was a lesson in heat and how to manage it. You understood this even before you knew anything about reactors or slugs or the acronyms that became a second language for the initiated. The buildings sat like low mountains with a geometry that refused all romance, and yet they had a strange beauty, the way any machine has beauty when it is perfectly sure of its purpose. The first impression was people, so many of them, arriving in waves that sometimes felt like tides. Construction crews ate and slept and left, and came back as if the site were a port rather than a desert. Trailers multiplied until someone decided to give them streets and the streets names, and then the names began to tell their own story about permanence. From the highway, the compound life looked like a promises market. A commissary that had expected 100 now held 400. A barracks designed for men in one shift now swallowed 2 shifts with good humor and bad sleep. The German prisoners who worked farms and orchards within a long day's reach of this world heard versions of the same story over and over from Americans who weren't sure whether to be proud or alarmed. It was a story that emphasized size as a way to avoid detail. There was a building so long you could forget the other end existed. There was a pump that could drink a ditch dry faster than a man could finish a cigarette. There were so many badges at shift change that the gate seemed to bristle. Inside the main yards, where few outsiders ever walked, everything was designed to control the consequences of heat. The logic of pipes and shielding was a language you could read with your eyes alone. Heat was made, carried, bled, and hidden. Water flowed in designs that cared more about flow than about grace, and the concrete had a gravity about it that discouraged fanciful thinking. People in that environment learned to move like careful thoughts, never rushing, never lingering where lingering would turn curiosity into danger. The culture that formed around such work had the confidence of any competence that confronts a hard truth daily. There was nothing sentimental in it, no romance about the atom, only a respect for procedures that earned their keep by leaving everyone alive. That tone, the sober normality of handling forces that could not be forgiven, leaked outward into the trailers and the stores. It trained the whole town to speak softly without surrendering its sense of humor. Hanford's secrecy was not designed to mystify so much as to underwhelm. If you asked a worker the right question, he would give you the wrong answer honestly. He did this not because he wanted to deceive you, but because the right answer was not his to know. Jobs were defined with a precision that kept people safe from the burden of a whole picture. A chemist described a stage with professional pride and no context. A mechanic explained a maintenance cycle that read like liturgy. A guard offered the choreography of his gait, and nothing beyond it. The result was not so much a wall as a labyrinth whose walls were built of modest truths. German prisoners, used to hierarchies that trusted rumor as much as doctrine, found the American practice of deliberate not knowing both frustrating and effective. A man who cannot help you does not become an enemy. He becomes an end point. The river was an accomplice in all of this. Its cold strength both permitted and excused the scale of the undertaking. And if you listened to men who had worked the canyons of chemistry or the yards that fed the reactors, you could hear in their voices a fear disguised as fondness when they spoke about the water. They trusted it the way you trust a horse that knows the way home. They also understood that the river kept secrets of its own, secrets that could never be as simple as turning a valve. A German listening to that talk, which was half shop and half folklore, would understand that a natural ally had been recruited into the American coalition. You do not beat a country that makes friends with its geography and then pays enough to keep those friendships healthy. Living at Hanford was living with thresholds. The line between safe and unsafe was everywhere but invisible, verified not by sight but by instrument and ritual. In any other city, rituals exist to heighten meaning. Here, rituals existed to pacify it. You washed your hands as if the water itself could count to a number you could not imagine. You checked seals and numbers and readouts with an attention that left you tired at night in a way no shovel ever could. And then you went to a cafeteria that served pie like any other cafeteria and listened to the same news about the weather and baseball and a gas price somewhere else. The juxtaposition was almost comic. It was also the only way to live in a town that woke each morning to the possibility that the day would ask it to be exquisitely perfect for 12 hours and then again for 12 more. For prisoners whose war had been defined by the sound of bombers and the ache of shortages, Hanford represented a kind of patience that felt both alien and maddening. There was no obvious drama unless you knew where to look. The emergency was the routine. The crisis was the plan. You could stand at the edge of the site and be bored if you were not trained to read the landscape of pipes and outbuildings the way a forester reads a stand of trees. But if you did learn to read it even badly, you could not escape the conclusion that the place was one of those palaces of purpose that the modern world occasionally builds and then pretends are accidents. The American government had not tripped into Hanford. It had bent space around an idea until the idea could be treated like a factory order. By the end of the war, the men who had made the desert feed this machine did not boast. They looked tired in photographs, as if their faces were unfinished drafts. They had learned to live inside the modesty required by work that punishes vanity, and that modesty was itself a form of concealment. If they had told you the truth, it would not have sounded like much. Pumps, pipes, checks, logs, more checks. But they knew, and a few of the German scientists who later read the dry words of post-war summaries knew that the truth was larger than any noun. The truth was that the United States had learned to make a kind of heat at will and to store it inside a device that obeyed orders. Hanford had turned fear into plumbing, and in so doing had made it transportable. Very few sentences in history have carried more weight. Los Alamos was a city built to think with its hands. The road up was a narrowing argument with gravity, and when you arrived you felt not secrecy but concentration, as if the whole town were a lens ground for a single flame. The buildings did not announce themselves as factories. They had the posture of schools and workshops, and the brown of the dirt and the white of the sky met at angles that taught the eye to expect clarity. People had come from universities where abstractions were their natural currency, and they were asked to spend those abstractions like cash on tables, where nothing but steel and explosive and soda and time could be trusted. The conversion rate was harsh and exhilarating. A theory that could not be milled into a part was a story. A part that could not be made to fit was an insult. In that pressure, even friendship became a discipline. Everything that Oak Ridge and Hanford had coaxed into existence showed up here as material and as problem. Uranium and plutonium were no longer promises but facts. And facts have personalities. They are stubborn in their own ways, which is just another way of saying that nature can be taught to cooperate, but never to flatter you. The scientists and machinists and explosive experts learned each other's habits, the way professional soldiers learn each other's jokes. A mathematician came to trust a welder's eye. A physicist learned to respect the caution of a technician whose hands had learned the story of a seam through burns and recovered mistakes. The rhythm of days was argument, agreement, trial, revision. The nights were talk and the kind of fatigue that only follows work, you know, to be both justified and fragile. Everyone lived with the knowledge that the simplest error could make a liar of the most elegant proof. The moral weather was different at Los Alamos than anywhere else in the project. In the valley towns you could live a long time without thinking about the consequence of your work, because consequence was not present tense. Here, consequence was the dialect everyone spoke. You could go to dinner knowing you had voted. In the small way, a design choice is a vote for a future that included a brightness the world had never seen. People managed this knowledge differently. Some wore it like a starched collar. Some tried to soften it with humor that hurt to hear. Some put it in a box and smothered it with the kindness of daily life. Almost everyone believed, for as long as belief was useful, that the device would save lives by ending a war that had turned the world into a sieve. They also believed, because they were not fools, that what they were building belonged to a category of truth that would not be returned to its shelf when the war ended. A captured German scientist, hearing about Los Alamos from the same radio that carried the news of Hiroshima, would recognize the signatures of this place, even without a map. The scale of coordination implied parallel trials and the courage to abandon a beautiful approach if it would not answer to the calendar. The quality of output implied machine shops, where tolerance was elevated to doctrine. The fact of success implied a management culture capable of holding together men who were not by nature obedient, and who measured their days in solved puzzles rather than orders obeyed. That is a rarer victory than any detonation. It asks a country not only to buy equipment but to buy time, and to waste some of that time on false starts and rehearsals that look, to anyone impatient, like hesitation. Los Alamos did not hesitate. It moved at a pace that honored both urgency and craft, which is another way of saying it did not lie to itself. The physical proof of that pace sits in photographs that never show enough to satisfy curiosity. You see a man in a lab coat holding his breath as if that might help the instrument calm down. You see a woman at a desk transcribing numbers with a concentration that makes you want to whisper. You see a cluster of men on a mesa looking like a scene from an engineering pastoral. Nothing in those images explains the gravity of the conversations that led to them. But if you have ever loved a tool, or forgiven one for failing you, you can read those images like a diary. The place is full of people who have been asked to replace the abstract satisfactions of the blackboard with the concrete humility of parts that either work or do not. That swap is not only a professional transformation, it is a moral one. It shifts the burden from brilliance to reliability, from "I believe" to "I can make it again tomorrow." The test in the desert was not a moment so much as a mirror in which the town saw itself plain. Everything that had been argued in long sentences became a light that could not be argued with. A device built from other people's schedules and decisions and compromises rose toward inevitability and then made a sound that Earth has not forgotten. The witnesses describe awe, terror, elation, silence, prayer. Those words are poor at their jobs here. What happened to Los Alamos in that light is bigger and smaller than language. Bigger, because the event confirmed a theory of the world that whole careers had only been allowed to suspect. Smaller, because it reduced grand projects to a single yes. That yes carried forward to cities that had never heard of mesas and to men who were not consulted. That yes was what the war wanted, and the war always knew how to collect. Afterward, the town did not become less itself. It became more intensely what it had always been, a place arranged around a problem that had been solved and therefore could be repeated. People began to think like custodians of a truth instead of suitors. The captured scientists, reading transcripts later, betrayed a complicated respect. They had believed they understood the integers of the problem, the physics, the chemistry, the metallurgy, and then discovered that there were also human integers. How much doubt a team can carry and still function, how far a plan can be bent before it breaks, how often a manager must throw away a week's work to save a month. Los Alamos solved those numbers with the same blunt grace it applied to everything else. If it could not be done beautifully, it would be done correctly. If it could not be explained to a visitor, it would be explained to a lathe. The war ended, and the mesa remained. People went on living there with a sense that they belonged to a postscript that had learned to speak like a preface. The rest of the country went back to the business of forgetting in public what it celebrates in private, but Los Alamos carried forward in the frank daylight of a place that had made a bargain with the future and could not pretend otherwise. A German prisoner who had first met America as a rumor of abundance could see, in the silhouette of that mesa against a clean sky, the logic of the entire program. Build the parts elsewhere, teach them to behave here, and let the results speak once and for all. The story of disbelief does not unfold in laboratories or behind gates alone. It unfolds in mess halls, along fence lines, at the edge of beet fields, in the back corners of county fairgrounds where prisoners were hired out to pick, stack, mend, and haul. The United States held hundreds of thousands of German POWs, and the country learned, with an ease that astonished the prisoners, to fold them into the war's domestic economy as labor that was both cheap and cleanly managed. For many of those men, the America they came to know was not the America of cities and skylines, but a net of small towns whose prosperity had not been removed by bombs and whose rhythm was half church bell, half train whistle. They were fed regularly, clothed decently, and most disorienting to men raised on rations paid a token wage that arrived as predictably as the weather. In such places, rumors develop an ethics. You do not repeat every story you hear, because you quickly learn that the most dramatic versions of America are the ones told by people who crave a response. You trust, instead, the quiet foreman whose uncle drives trucks near a place that nobody names, and who says without flourish that he has never seen so many lights in the dark. You trust the woman at the grocer who mentions prices without complaint and then remarks that a certain road is closed most nights because the buses own it. You trust the local paper, which hints at construction beyond the county and uses proper nouns sparingly, as if language itself might be rationed under some new policy. Every detail is modest, the accumulation is not. A town has doubled, and then doubled again. A rail spur has been laid as if by decree, and feeds an address that can only be described by its distance from other things. A dam is running high, even in a dry month. The prisoners make sense of this world first by comparison. They hold the remembered schedules of their home cities against the living schedules of American towns, and notice that one key property of prosperity is elasticity. When a new need arrives, American roads find lanes, American shops find stock, American managers find second shifts. Flexibility is not an accident, it is an industry. In that light, the unbelievable becomes possible. If a country can decide today to pick apples in a county it did not know last year, then perhaps it can also decide to feed a valley, a kind of current that most factories would be ashamed to ask for. So the disbelief that guarded dignity at the start of captivity begins to loosen. The prisoners are not fools. They resist any story that flatters their hosts, but they see with their own eyes that the host has an appetite for logistics, and that this appetite could swallow a project 10 times larger than any story they heard whispered in barracks. Word of the atomic sites rides on this same network of modest trust. A guard with no desire to impress anyone mentions a cousin who moved to a place he cannot talk about and writes home about hills that now glow faintly at night where they did not glow before. A farmer whose fields lie along a freight line notes that the trains have a new smell when they pass, a clean metallic tang that makes him think of fresh-cut wire. A bus depot records a contract that seems to replenish itself by magic. None of these testimonies contains a secret. All of them contain context. A rumor is a lie that has not learned arithmetic. A context is a truth that cannot show its face. The prisoners collect contexts until context turns into conclusion. Somewhere, several somewheres, the United States is doing with physics what it has already done with wheat, steel, cars, and songs, turning theory into throughput. The moral dimension of this knowledge is not simple for them. Many have faced American soldiers in the field and learned to respect their professionalism without loving their cause. Those same men are now asked, by proximity if not by policy, to respect a different kind of professionalism, the genius of aggregation. They begin to understand that the American gift is not mere abundance, but the ability to aim abundance at an objective with a steadiness that makes the aiming look accidental. In camp lectures, when an officer explains the Geneva provisions or announces a change in work detail, the prisoners listen with the weary courtesy of men who know they cannot influence rules. But afterward, in smaller knots under shaded eaves, they try to figure out whether the story about a secret town could be literally true. The argument flows, as all good arguments do, through examples, and someone always has a fresh example. The grocer added 2 new cashiers and shortened the queue by half. The baseball diamond got lights so night games can draw more people. The cannery hired 100 women in a week and did not miss a day. A country that can do that might have found a way to put a fence around a city and make the fence feel like a border rather than a wall. Their disbelief takes a final blow when the radio carries news from the Pacific that has no metaphor. Whatever America has been building is no longer a rumor or a category of industrial art. It is a device that alters the horizon of war. Camp newspapers reprint official bulletins in cautious type, and the POWs begin to adjust their memories to match a world in which their captors constructed a new kind of power while still finding time to feed prisoners decent bread. The captured scientists, in a different country but inside the same echo, learn the details of the bomb's success and run quick sums in their heads that tell them what the prisoners have intuited without mathematics, that a nation capable of such coordination might not be matched on that field for a generation. Resentment survives, as it always does, but it loses altitude. It cannot live for long at the height where facts fly. Years later, the men will tell their sons and daughters versions of these American months that sound both critical and admiring. They will talk about hypocrisy and kindness, about the casual racism that marked some encounters and the random neighborliness that redeemed others. They will remember the taste of coffee that did not need sugar to be drinkable, and the shock of store windows full of things that no one had bombed a week before. And when they reach for an image to explain why the atomic story felt inevitable in retrospect, they will likely choose something humble, the way a bus stopped on time every day, or the glint of new copper in a town that did not yet have a name on any map. Because in the end, disbelief did not die under a mushroom cloud. It died under the steady accumulation of competence. The United States did not persuade its captives of its power with speeches. It persuaded them by running a civilization with such undeniable regularity that even enemies trusted its clocks. The shape of belief, then, is not a revelation but a graph. It rises slowly, hesitates at the points where pride wants it to flatten, and then climbs again because the data insists. The German prisoners, many of whom had been taught to see Plines, America as violent in its appetites and childish in its culture, left their camps having learned a more dangerous truth, that childish cultures do not build secret cities that function without fuss, and that violent appetites do not learn to count this well. They had witnessed, up close and by accident, the most American of talents, the ability to make the extraordinary look procedural, and once you have seen that talent applied to lunch and laundry, you are almost ready to believe that it might also be applied to atoms. In an English country house called Farm Hall, 10 German nuclear specialists listened to an ordinary radio carry, an extraordinary sentence. An American bomb had destroyed a city. The room did not move, but everyone inside it changed. A few men tried laughter, the brittle kind scholars use when a proof collapses and pride needs a disguise. Others reached for technical caveats that felt safe yesterday and foolish now. Perhaps the report was propaganda, perhaps a chemical conflagration misread as something no chemistry could explain, perhaps a bluff. Then details arrived like stones through glass, and the arguments broke in sequence. No one doubted the physics. What failed, audibly, was their belief that logistics could be made to obey so soon and at such tremendous scale. They had assumed, with the certainty of men accustomed to scarcity, that enrichment pathways must be explored one at a time, that pilot plants should age into factories, that bureaucracy would slow genius until genius learned patience. The broadcast proved that a different civilization had written a different contract with time. The recorded conversations, caught by microphones hidden in skirting boards and lampshades, read today like a play about humility. Embarrassment ripens into reluctant respect. Conjecture hardens into arithmetic. One man insists there cannot be enough uranium enriched to weapons purity for repeated use. Another, quieter and suddenly older, replies that a nation able to build entire towns for a single purpose is a nation able to fund multiple processes until one delivers. They count backwards from the detonation to the necessary machinery, cascades running in parallel, chemical canyons that separate plutonium from stories, railheads that never sleep, a payroll measured in zip codes. Each inference is a confession that what was impossible in a bombed economy is trivial, with enough copper and stillness, in an unbombed one. What makes Farm Hall essential to this tale is its purity of surprise. The prisoners in Midwestern beet fields had inferred an American miracle from bus schedules and the polite tyranny of abundance. The experts in Cambridgeshire derived the same miracle from their own field equations and realized that management, procurement, power, planning has been the missing variable in their models. They speak tenderly of equations because equations never betrayed them. They speak cautiously of America because America just has. By midnight, the conversation sounds like a seminar on repentance. Pride survives, as pride does, but it loses its prosecutorial swagger. They concede what the POWs had already learned without mathematics, that the United States had organized a civilization of throughput, and that such a civilization can do in 3 years what a brilliant laboratory cannot do in 10. In the quiet between remarks, you can hear a realization heavier than defeat. They had not misjudged neutrons. They had misjudged what a continent at peace with itself could do to time. Morning found them older, chastened, and newly curious about management, a discipline they had treated as clerical nuisance, not destiny. The Manhattan Project did not defeat arithmetic. It hired it. Budgets that looked monstrous in committee shrank on contact with purpose, because purpose multiplies dollars the way heat multiplies scent. American planners learned early that uncertainty is cheaper than delay, and they bought multiple answers at once, letting time choose the winner. To a European mind surviving 1943, that looks like waste. To an American quartermaster, it looks like insurance. The factories that would have made washing machines made separators. Men who would have repaired roofs learned to swear at tolerances. River systems that once promised comfort began promising current. A budget is not a number. It is a choreography of steel, copper, labor, and patience. And the choreography here was ruthless and kind at once. Ruthless, because committees lost arguments that elsewhere would have won on elegance. If a process looked theoretically superior but could not be massed, it yielded to one that could. Kind, because the system refused to treat failure as betrayal. A plant that taught engineers what not to do paid for itself. A parallel line that came second saved the first when parts ran short. The economy that carried this philosophy had advantages both natural and political. It owned vast sources of hydropower and coal, and a grid that could be bullied into new shapes without collapsing. It owned distance that could be turned into safety, and safety that could be turned into speed. It owned a banking system willing to hide a colossal project inside ordinary ledgers until the ledgers themselves began to glow. Germany possessed genius in abundance. What it lacked by 1943 were the raw continuities that turned genius into production. The skies would not leave its factories alone. Railway junctions behaved like targets painted in the wrong century's colours. In that environment, prudence looks like caution but is simply poverty in a responsible suit. The American mainland, unbombed and bored by peacetime habits, could be persuaded to accept a new appetite. The lights did not dim, they slid. Power went where it was pointed. Budgets thickened in the night and thinned at dawn into concrete, wiring, payroll, coffee and bus diesel. Even the hum of the transformer yards took on a moral colour. This is the noise of money being made to behave. The arithmetic is simple now, and was simple then. Spend enough, early enough, on enough approaches, and you will earn certainty while your enemy is still earning permission. That certainty expresses itself as factories that do not pause, as test stands that see failure as rehearsal, as managers who believe their job is to remove friction and then get out of the way. German POWs could not believe the United States had paid for cities that did not appear on maps. Farm Hall's physicists could not believe the Americans had paid for time. Both were looking at the same ledger, written in copper and will, ending on a line labelled deliverable, utterly. Wartime rumour loves a tour, so the first claim the prisoners heard had a guide's voice. They said German captives were being led through the heart of American bomb plants. The reality was duller and more formidable. The facilities were built on a doctrine of compartmentalization that made spectacle impossible. A civilian might see a fence and a bus. A guard might see a badge and a rule. A machinist might see a drawing with intolerant tolerances. No one outside the inner ring could assemble a meaning large enough to impress even a bored private. The truths were horizontal and narrow, each one a plank laid beside another until a hidden bridge existed. You could cross without ever knowing what river lay below. Another claim wore the bravado of saloon math. Oak Ridge, it boasted, used more electricity than New York City. That version flatters two audiences at once, the teller and the listener, and leaves both misled. The reality is stranger and sufficient. The Valley's appetite reached into a measurable slice of national generation during the war years, an allocation that would have been unthinkable in any bombed country and barely thinkable in a peaceful one. The point is not to crown a champion of kilowatts. The point is to recognize that the grid itself had become a weapon, and that the weapon could be aimed. When you arm a nation with its own utilities, you give it the ability to turn geography into doctrine. The third claim came wrapped in old pride, that Germany had been within reach of the same device and simply unfortunate in timing. The reality requires fewer heroics and admits more context. German science was brilliant, but brilliance was being asked to work from basements and to commute through wreckage. In that environment, boldness could not scale. The Americans did not outthink better physicists. They simply outspent and outprotected them, surrounding ideas with factories instead of with arguments. The farm hall conversations, when read without romance, are a diary of clever men suddenly fluent in logistics. They recognize, too late for pride's comfort, that the decisive variable was not a new equation but a new condition. Time made large by money and safety. Reality, then, is not a scold but a solvent. It dissolves the lacquer of thrilling untruths and leaves a more impressive grain. No power was escorted through enrichment halls. No single town humiliated every city on the grid. No rival program hovered one lucky week from parity. What happened instead was less quotable and more durable. A government refused to be elegant at the cost of being early. It built redundancy into schedule, paid for parallelism, protected silence with routine, and turned rivers and railroads into accomplices. By the time rumors had finished flattering themselves, the work was already complete. The facts, when finally allowed to speak plainly, sounded almost modest, which is how certainty speaks when it does not require applause. The disbelief that this story tracks is not a flaw in character. It is the mind's immune system reacting to a dose of scale. German prisoners who had learned to live inside scarcity walked into an America whose ordinary days looked like festivals of competence, and they reached first for skepticism, because skepticism protects dignity. They were right to doubt. Any claim worth believing should withstand doubt. And yet the claims about America's atomic cities kept resembling facts even when stripped of adjectives, so the doubt had to learn manners or leave. What replaced it was not surrender, but a revised map of possibility. That a country untouched by bombers can spend recklessly and still be prudent, can multiply approaches and still arrive early, can hide ambition in routine, and still call itself a normal place to raise children. The lesson for anyone trying to understand power is that genius is an accelerant, not a fuel. The fuel is infrastructure. Rivers, grids, rail junctions, inland distances, payrolls that arrive, cafeterias that never run out of coffee, managers who will cancel pretty ideas and overfund ugly ones if the calendar demands it. These are the unphotogenic victories that make history loud. Germany had plenty of accelerant. The war kept stealing its fuel. The United States learned to pour fuel without ceremony and to keep the flame banked where only the necessary people could feel the heat. The result was not merely a weapon but a behavior, a way of turning theory into throughput that would define more than war work in the years after. The moral is also uncomfortable. A system that can hide cities can hide costs. Secrecy protects lives and corrodes accountability. It shortens wars and lengthens shadows. The workers who kept silent were not saints or villains. They were citizens practicing a discipline their moment demanded. The prisoners who recognized the discipline were not traitors to pride. They were witnesses with eyes open. Between them stands a fact that resists euphemism. Immense national projects leave marks long after their goals are met, in water and soil, in budgets and bureaucracies, in the stories a people tells about what competence entitles it to attempt next. Honest admiration should not preclude careful memory. If you listen closely to the end of this tale, the loudest sound is ordinary. It is a bus arriving on time. It is a transformer humming like a cat fallen asleep under a fence line. It is the click of a badge at a gate that opens because the shift must turn. These are the sounds the German POWs learned to trust, and they point to the truth more directly than any speech about destiny. America built an industrial continent behind a curtain of routine and then pulled the cord in a desert where the sky could carry a new noun. The astonishment that followed was righteous. The lesson that endures is practical. Competence, aimed, is a force of nature.